The prison guard who taught inmates to read during his breaks never knew one would become a lawyer who'd fight for his daughter. But that's how fate works sometimes, weaving lives together in patterns too complex to see until you're standing at the end of the tapestry, looking back. Officer James Mercer didn't consider himself a hero. Not even close. He was just a man who'd spent 23 years watching life pass by through the reinforced windows of Hartford County Correctional Facility. At 48, his dark hair was retreating and lines had settled permanently around his eyes. Not from laughter, but from squinting down long institutional hallways where fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects. James moved through the prison with the careful efficiency of someone who had memorized every potential danger. His boots made deliberate clicks against the concrete floor as he performed his morning rounds, the sound echoing off the cold walls. The jangling keys at his hip had long ago stopped being noticeable to him, the way constant pain eventually becomes background noise. "Morning, Mercer," called Officer Diaz, passing in the opposite direction. James nodded but didn't slow his pace. Small talk felt like a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. Not since Emily's diagnosis. The words aggressive form and expensive treatment options had been ricocheting inside his skull for weeks now, drowning out everything else. His daughter was only 16. She should be worrying about prom dresses and college applications, not whether her hair would fall out or if she'd see her 17th birthday. The weight of her future pressed down on his shoulders as he turned the corner towards cell block D. The inmates were just finishing breakfast. Some lingered at metal tables, hunched over trays of food that James knew was barely edible. Others had already returned to their cells, where they would spend most of another identical day. James had long stopped seeing them as individuals. They were uniforms, numbers, problems to manage. It was easier that way. Until Marcus Johnson. James first noticed him in the prison library, a cavernous room with metal shelves and books so old their spines had faded to ghostly imprints of titles. Marcus sat alone at a table, his large frame hunched over a children's book, finger tracing under words with painstaking slowness. His lips moved silently, brow furrowed in concentration that seemed out of place on a man serving 8 years for armed robbery. Something about the sight tugged at James. Perhaps it was the vulnerability, so rare in this place where weakness was currency no one could afford to spend. Or maybe it was just that James had spent the previous night going through Emily's medical bills, calculating figures that refused to add up to anything but despair. James watched Marcus struggle with the simple text for several minutes before approaching. The inmate's shoulders immediately tensed, his hands folding over the book as if to hide evidence of a crime. "You having trouble with that?" James asked, his voice gruffer than he intended. Marcus stared up at him, wariness etched into every line of his face. At 32, he looked older, his dark skin ashen under the harsh library lights. "I'm fine, Officer Mercer." James glanced at the open page. "The Cat in the Hat," he observed without inflection. "My daughter loved that book when she was little." A flicker of something, shame perhaps, crossed Marcus's face. "Just passing time," he muttered. "You can't read, can you?" James said quietly, making sure no one else was within earshot. Marcus's jaw tightened. For a moment, James thought he might deny it, but then his shoulders slumped slightly. "Never got the chance to learn proper," he admitted. "Been faking it most of my life." James should have walked away. It wasn't his problem. He had enough of his own. But Emily's face flashed in his mind, the way she used to look when he'd read to her before bed, eyes wide with wonder at worlds that existed between pages. "My break's in 20 minutes, James said, surprising himself. "I could help you with that if you want." The words hung between them, fragile as breath on a winter morning. Marcus studied him, searching for the trap, the joke, the cruelty that so often came disguised as kindness in these walls. "Why would you do that?" Marcus finally asked. James didn't have an answer that made sense, not even to himself. 20 minutes, he repeated, already turning away. "Library corner table." That first session was awkward, tense with mutual distrust. James had grabbed a more appropriate book from the adult literacy section, and they sat with it open between them like a contract neither was sure they wanted to sign. Marcus stumbled over simple words, his frustration evident in the way his large hands curled into fists when he couldn't sound out "through" or "enough." "English doesn't make any damn sense," Marcus growled after 10 minutes. "No argument there," James agreed, surprising them both with the hint of a smile. "But once you get the rules, even the stupid ones, you can break into any book you want." Marcus looked skeptical. What's the point? Not like reading's gonna change anything for me." James thought about the stack of medical journals on his nightstand, each highlighting experimental treatments he could barely understand, let alone afford. Maybe not, he conceded, but it beats staring at the walls. The 20 minutes ended too quickly. James stood, suddenly aware of how irregular this was, how it might look to his fellow officers. "Same time tomorrow," he said, making it sound like an order rather than an offer. Marcus nodded once, his expression unreadable. James didn't tell anyone about the reading lessons. They became a secret ritual. 20 minutes during his lunch break, 3 times a week. He'd eat a sandwich in 10 minutes, then spend the remaining time with Marcus in the library corner, working through basic texts that grew gradually more complex. Weeks passed. The routine became something James found himself anticipating rather than dreading. Marcus was a quick study once he got past his initial embarrassment. His determination was impressive. The same intensity that had once been channeled into less productive pursuits now focused on conquering the written word. "Why didn't you learn as a kid?" James asked one day, after Marcus successfully read an entire page without help. Marcus was quiet for so long that James thought he wouldn't answer. "Then foster care. Moved around too much. By the time anyone noticed I couldn't read, I was too old, too angry to admit I needed help." He shrugged. Easier to be the bad kid than the stupid kid. James nodded, thinking of the statistics he'd read about literacy and incarceration rates. "You're not stupid," he said firmly. "Just never had the chance." "What about your daughter?" Marcus asked, changing the subject. "The one who liked Dr. Seuss." Something twisted in James's chest. He rarely spoke about Emily here. It felt wrong somehow, like bringing something pure into a place that would taint it. But Marcus was looking at him with genuine interest, not the calculated curiosity inmates often use to gain leverage. "Emily," James said, the name feeling strange on his lips in this setting. "She's 16 now, smart as they come, planning to study medicine." He didn't mention the cancer. Didn't talk about how those plans now hung in the balance, dependent on treatments they couldn't afford on a prison guard's salary, even with insurance that seemed designed to deny rather than cover. But something must have shown in his face because Marcus frowned slightly. "Everything okay with her?" "Fine," James said curtly, glancing at his watch. "Time's up for today." As winter settled over the prison, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that the aging heating system couldn't combat, Emily's condition worsened. James started missing shifts to take her to appointments, using up sick days and vacation time at an alarming rate. When he was at work, he moved through his duties like a ghost, present but not really there. The reading sessions with Marcus became one of the few constants he could count on. They'd progressed to short articles from magazines and newspapers, real-world text that Marcus could use. "You look like hell," Marcus observed bluntly one December afternoon as James rubbed his reddened eyes. "Thanks," James replied dryly. "Let's get started." But Marcus didn't open the book. "Something's wrong," he said. "Has been for weeks now." James stared at the institutional clock on the wall, watching seconds tick away. He should maintain professional distance. That was the rule. Don't let inmates see your weakness. Don't make yourself vulnerable. But he was so tired of carrying this alone. "Emily's sick," he said finally, the words scraping his throat. "Cancer. The treatments," he shook his head. "Insurance won't cover the specialist she needs. I'm trying to get a second mortgage, but the house isn't worth much, and my credit isn't great." The admission hung in the air between them. James immediately regretted it. This wasn't Marcus's burden. They weren't friends. This was a prison, and he was a guard, and some lines shouldn't be crossed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said simply. "No platitudes, no false promises. Just acknowledgement." James nodded stiffly. "Let's get back to the lesson." They read an article about a new environmental law. James corrected Marcus's pronunciation of legislation and sustainability. Neither mentioned Emily again. But the following week, Marcus had a piece of paper waiting when James arrived. "I've been practicing," he said, sliding it across the table. It was a letter painfully handwritten in careful block letters. James read it silently. "Dear Officer Mercer, I have a cousin who works for Bright Health Foundation. They help kids with cancer when insurance won't pay. I wrote to him about Emily. He said they might be able to help if you fill out some forms. I hope this is okay. I know it's not my business. Marcus Johnson." James read it twice, something tight and hot building in his chest. "You did this?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Just passing along information. Probably nothing will come of it." But something did come of it. The Bright Health Foundation reached out to James the following week. There was an application process, interviews, medical evaluations. No guarantees, they stressed, but they specialized in exactly the treatment protocol Emily's oncologist had recommended. When James told Marcus that Emily had been accepted into the program, the inmate's usually impassive face broke into a genuine smile. "That's good," he said simply. "Real good." Their reading sessions continued, taking on new meaning. James brought in more challenging material. Legal briefs he'd found online, sections of the state penal code. Marcus absorbed it all with growing confidence. "You have a knack for this," James observed one day as Marcus dissected a particularly convoluted paragraph about precedent law. "Ever thought about what you'll do when you get out?" Marcus laughed, though there was little humor in it. "Ex-con with no high school diploma? I'll be lucky to get a job washing dishes." "You could get your GED," James suggested. "Community college after that, maybe." "Right," Marcus said skeptically. "And how would I pay for that?" James didn't have an answer, but the question stayed with him, nagging at his conscience in a way he couldn't explain. Spring arrived, bringing with it cautious hope. Emily's treatments were working, slowly, painfully, but working. The dark shadows beneath her eyes had lightened, and sometimes, when she didn't think he was looking, James caught glimpses of her old smile. "Dad," she said one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You never talk about work anymore." James tensed. He'd kept his two worlds separate, the sterile hospital corridors and the prison's cold concrete hallways existing in parallel universes that never touched. Except they had touched through Marcus. "Not much to tell," he said evasively. Emily gave him a look that was so much like her mother's it made his heart ache. Sarah had been gone for 10 years now, but in moments like these she was vividly present in their daughter's expressions. "The foundation that's helping with my treatments," Emily said carefully. "I looked them up. They usually have a waiting list of months, sometimes years, but I got in right away." "That's unusual," James sighed. Emily had always been too perceptive for her own good. "I had some help," he admitted. "From an inmate, actually. He has a connection there." Emily's eyes widened. "An inmate? Why would he help you?" It was a fair question, one James had asked himself repeatedly over the past months. "I've been teaching him to read," he said finally. "During my breaks." "Teaching him to read," Emily repeated slowly. "For how long?" "Since last fall." Emily was quiet for a moment, processing this. "That's really nice, Dad." James shrugged uncomfortably. "It's just 20 minutes 3 times a week. 20 minutes that might have saved my life," she said softly. The words hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't allowed himself to connect those dots so explicitly. But she was right. Without Marcus's letter, without the Foundation's help, Emily's prognosis would have been drastically different. "What's out of your sharp? What's his name?" Emily asked. "The inmate." "Marcus," James said. "Marcus Johnson." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to thank him someday." James almost said it was impossible, that there were rules, boundaries that couldn't be crossed, but the words died in his throat. Hadn't those boundaries already been crossed? Hadn't something fundamental shifted the moment he'd sat down across from Marcus and opened that first book? "Maybe someday," he said instead. Summer brought change. Emily's strength returned gradually, like a tide coming in, each day bringing her a little closer to the shore of health. She would need ongoing treatment, monitoring, but the worst seemed behind them. Marcus, meanwhile, had become functionally literate. He devoured books now, history, biography, and especially law. Something about legal language appealed to him, the precision of it, the way it built arguments brick by brick. "I'm getting out in 2 months," Marcus said during one of their sessions. They rarely spoke of his impending release, though both were aware of the date approaching. James nodded. "Any plans?" "My cousin says I can stay with him while I get on my feet. He's in Hartford." Marcus hesitated. "I was thinking about what you said. About the GED. It would open doors," James said carefully. "More than that," Marcus said, looking down at the book between them. A primer on constitutional law they'd been working through. "I want to understand this stuff. Really understand it." James studied him, seeing not the inmate he'd first encountered in the library, but the man who had emerged through their sessions. Thoughtful, determined, with an analytical mind that caught nuances others might miss. "You could," James said, surprised to find he meant it. "It wouldn't be easy, but you could." Marcus's release day came with little fanfare. There was paperwork, a small bag of possessions, awkward goodbyes with the few inmates he'd been friendly with. James was on duty, but they'd agreed to keep things professional. No special farewells, nothing to raise eyebrows. When Marcus passed through the final checkpoint, James gave him a brief nod. "Good luck," he said formally. "Thank you, Officer Mercer," Marcus replied with equal formality, but his eyes held the weight of everything unsaid. The hours spent hunched over books, the gradual building of trust, the letter that had changed everything for Emily. And then he was gone, the heavy doors closing behind him with finality. Life resumed its rhythm. Emily returned to school for her senior year, thinner and more solemn than before, but alive, planning for a future that once had seemed impossible. James continued his shifts at the prison, occasionally helping other inmates with basic literacy, though never with the same regularity or investment he'd shown with Marcus. Sometimes he wondered what had become of him, whether he'd managed to get his GED, whether he'd found work, whether the words they decoded together had opened any of the doors James had hoped they might. But there was no way to know. Contact between guards and former inmates was discouraged, and James had never been one to break rules without good reason. Years passed. Emily graduated high school, then college, then medical school, specializing in pediatric oncology, determined to help children facing the same battle she had survived. James retired from the prison system after 30 years, his body grateful to be free of the constant tension, the vigilance that had become second nature. He was tending to his small vegetable garden one spring morning when Emily's car pulled into the driveway. She wasn't expected. Her residency at Boston Children's Hospital kept her busier than he liked, and the surprise of her arrival made him straighten too quickly, his back protesting the sudden movement. "Dad," she called, emerging from the car with a wide smile. At 28, she was the image of her mother, the same warm eyes, the same way of tucking her hair behind her ear when excited about something. "This is unexpected," he said, embracing her. "Everything okay?" "Everything's great," she assured him. There's someone I want you to meet." She turned toward the car, where a second figure was now emerging from the passenger side. James squinted against the morning sun, trying to make out the visitor. A tall man in a charcoal suit approached, his bearing confident but with a hint of hesitation as he neared. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at James's memory. "Officer Mercer," the man said, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." The voice connected the dots that his aging eyes had missed. "Marcus?" James said incredulously, taking the offered hand. "Marcus Johnson?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way James had rarely seen during their prison sessions. "It's actually Marcus Johnson, Esquire, now," he said, a touch of pride warming his voice. "Though I still stumble over subsequent, and particularly sometimes." James looked from Marcus to Emily and back again, confusion evident. "You two know each other?" Emily grinned. "We met at a Bright Health Foundation fundraiser 3 months ago. I give talks sometimes about my experience as a recipient." She glanced at Marcus. He recognized my name right away. "I've been on their legal team for 2 years, Marcus explained. "Pro bono work mostly, helping families navigate insurance appeals, medical bankruptcies." James struggled to process this. The inmate who couldn't read the cat in the hat was now a lawyer. The connection he'd helped to make for Emily had somehow come full circle, bringing Marcus back into their lives. "You're a lawyer," he said, the words feeling insufficient. Marcus nodded. "Community college first, then state university. Scholarship to law school. It wasn't easy, but..." He shrugged. "I had a good foundation." The double meaning wasn't lost on James. "I just helped with the basics," he said gruffly. "Dad," Emily interjected, "Marcus is being modest. He's not just any lawyer. He specializes in healthcare advocacy for underprivileged families. He's built an entire practice around it." James looked at Marcus with new understanding. "You're still helping kids like Emily?" "Trying to," Marcus acknowledged. "There are too many families falling through the cracks, too many parents facing impossible choices." They moved to the porch where James poured lemonade, and they sat talking as the morning stretched toward noon. Marcus told him about the years after his release, the struggle to find employment, the night classes, the gradual accumulation of credits and credentials. He spoke of his first case as a newly minted lawyer, a family fighting their insurance company's denial of an experimental treatment for their son. "I thought about you and Emily a lot during that case," Marcus admitted. "About how things might have been different for you without the Foundation's help." James nodded, remembering the desperation of those dark days, the calculations that never added up to hope. "So you decided to specialize in medical law?" "It seemed right," Marcus said simply, "like the pieces fit together." Emily, who had been watching this exchange with bright eyes, reached over to touch her father's hand. Dad, there's actually another reason we came today. Marcus has a proposition for you. James raised an eyebrow, looking between them. Proposition? Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'm starting a literacy program for recently released inmates, he explained. Basic skills, GED prep, college application assistance. It's being funded through a grant from the State Rehabilitation Commission. Sounds worthwhile, James said cautiously. I need someone to help run it, Marcus continued. Someone who understands both sides, the system and the teaching. Someone with patience and, he smiled slightly, a certain stubborn persistence. James blinked, realization dawning. You're offering me a job? A partnership, Marcus corrected. We'd be co-directors. Your experience, my connections. Together we could help a lot of people find their way back. The proposal hung in the air between them, weighty with implications. James looked at Marcus, really looked at him, seeing not the former inmate or even the accomplished lawyer, but the complete arc of transformation. The journey from a man who couldn't read a children's book to one who had found purpose in helping others navigate complex systems. And somewhere in that journey was 20 minutes, 3 times a week, in a prison library corner. I don't know what to say, James admitted. Say yes, Dad, Emily urged softly. You've been restless since retirement. This would be perfect for you. James thought about the prison, about the men still inside those walls, many of whom would eventually be released into a world that had little use for them. He thought about Marcus, who had beaten those odds through determination and opportunity. An opportunity that had started with something as simple as learning to read. The prison guard who taught inmates to read during his breaks never knew one would become a lawyer, James said slowly, echoing Marcus's words from earlier. Never knew he'd end up working alongside him either. Marcus smiled. So that's a yes? James extended his hand. That's a yes. As they shook on it, James felt something settle into place, a sense of completion, of a circle closing. What had begun as a small act of kindness, offered in a moment when his own life seemed to be unraveling, had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. Through Marcus to Emily, through Emily back to Marcus, and now somehow back to him. Sometimes fate works that way, weaving lives together in patterns too complex to see until you're standing at the end of the tapestry, looking back. And sometimes, James realized as he looked between his daughter and the man who had helped save her, those patterns reveal themselves to be not random at all, but part of something larger, something that might almost be called purpose. The 3 of them sat on the porch long into the afternoon, planning for a future none of them could have envisioned 12 years earlier in that prison library corner, with a children's book open between them and 20 minutes on the clock.